Thanks, Shona, and good morning, everybody. It's really nice to be here again. Um, so this morning, as Shona said, I'm going to run through some recent major policy announcements made by the government on the area of insolvency, also the statistical picture, an update on our agency strategy, and the current priority areas of interest to my team. I'm just going to, there we are, thank you, just going to get the slides up. Let me make sure they're running through okay. Lovely. So turning to the government's recent policy announcement on the future of insolvency practitioner regulation. As you know, this has been an area worked on by the policy team in the Insolvency Service for a little while now. The consultation run last year sought views on a comprehensive package of reform to the current framework, and the government's response summarises those views of the very many stakeholders who replied. We're really grateful to everybody who took the time to consider those and to give those views to us. But the government response also sets out, as the name would suggest, the proposed way ahead for the reform that the government wants to take forward. It includes proposals for legislative change, and those will come forward when parliamentary time allows. So I will move into the detail of the announcement in a minute, but first of all, do want to acknowledge the time that's elapsed since the consultation was published. It has taken longer than it would have ideally to work through all of the detail, but my colleagues have been really mindful during that just how significant the potential reforms would be. And so the real intent was to get this absolutely right, to make sure that the new arrangements would work across the whole of Great Britain and that they would work in the way that is hoped for. So we know that change brings potential for disruption and uncertainty, and that may well have created quite a difficult time for people within the sector and for regulators. So I really am sorry for that. But hopefully now there's a nice, clear way forward. I'm really quite glad to be here with the announcement having been made and not having to say that it's still awaited. So let me move on to the detail of the announcements that there have been. So the government has announced that it will be retaining the current structure of professional body regulators, so not moving to a single government regulator. But it will, however, be challenging the current four professional body regulators to deliver significant and measurable improvements to the quality of regulation through non-legislative means. So that means working constructively and collaboratively together about a programme of improvements that will be delivered. And the government will be keeping under review the options to replace the current regulatory model with a single regulator if those improvements and those changes aren't possible to be secured. So on that decision to not introduce a single government regulator, I wanted to say a little more about that. So responses to the consultation showed that many stakeholders were keen on the concept of a single regulator, but also that replacing the current regulatory model with a single regulator located in the Insolvency Service wouldn't sufficiently improve confidence in regulation. So given the disruption that would also be brought by the creation of a standalone single regulator, and balanced against the real increased confidence that improvements are possible within the existing regulatory framework. So on that basis and balancing those factors, the government decided to retain the current framework. So moving on to the second bullet point here of the government response, another major change is that the government has announced that it will expand regulation to include the firms that provide insolvency services alongside the existing regulation of individual insolvency practitioners. And this change will close an important regulatory gap, and the intention is that it will strengthen the overall framework. The consultation responses to the proposals on the regulation of firms were overwhelmingly supportive, and the government intends to legislate when parliamentary time allows. And it will provide for a framework that includes a basic set of qualifying principles for the statutory authorisation and regulation of firms, and that won't include sole trader insolvency practitioners, but the framework will also include a prohibition on firms offering insolvency services unless they're properly authorised, a requirement for each authorised firm to appoint a senior responsible person, for there to be an appropriate sanctioning mechanism, and the facility to recover proportionate costs of regulation from regulated firms. As I say, all of that will need legislation, and that naturally takes time. But in advance of that, colleagues in our policy team will be working with the regulator bodies to assess whether and what steps could be taken to move towards this approach within the parameters of the current framework. So finally, on this slide, the government has also announced that it will be reforming the way in which ethical and professional standards for the profession are set. It intends that the Secretary of State will be given overall responsibility to set the ethical and technical standards for the insolvency profession, but that would be operated in collaboration with experts from the sector and the RPBs. So turning to the next slide, three further kind of points of the government's announcement in its response to the consultation. So the government response also confirmed it would introduce a public register of authorised insolvency practitioners and firms providing insolvency services. And the intention is that will include relevant and proportionate regulatory information. The announcement also set out that the government would be strengthening the bonding framework. On bonding, many of the responses to many of the proposals on minor reforms were positive, and the government is going to implement a set of amendments through secondary legislation when parliamentary time allows. I hope you've got your buzzword bingo sheets for the number of times I say that today. But those changes, those minor changes will be made. And that will include, just to run through those details, increasing the general penalty sum cover from £250,000 to £750,000, changes to the maximum indemnity period where that is applied by a bond provider, and cancellation due to non-payment, and extending the current minimum requirements of a bond to include an allowance for the reasonable associated costs of a bond in relation to the period of runoff and the treatment of interest or relating, and some further minor changes relating to the general penalty sum cover. All of the particular details set out in the government response document. In terms of the potential for more fundamental changes to the bonding regime, the government wants to consider these matters in more detail, and so a second consultation which covers those points will be issued in due course. And finally, in the theme of further consultation, the matter of compensation and redress also will be subject to a further consultation. The initial round of consultation quite understandably flagged a number of very complicated issues that need to be worked through, and so my policy colleagues will be doing that, and further proposals will be brought forward. So in summary, it's a really significant package of reform with the intention to strengthen the regulation framework and to increase public confidence. They bring regulation of insolvency into line with the ways that IPs now work, hopefully future-proof the regulatory framework. And as I say, some of the reforms will need legislation, but we are looking at non-legislative ways to introduce changes more quickly in advance of legislation when parliamentary time allows. So moving to the next slide, other policy announcements have also been made in relation to the personal insolvency review. As part of the government's agenda on promoting fair debt outcomes for everyone, as you'll be aware, the government, the Insolvency Service launched a review of the personal insolvency regime for England and Wales last year and issued their call for evidence. I'm going to run through what some of the themes of that call for evidence were this morning. I don't think I need to tell you, I don't suppose I do, that the insolvency regime has evolved considerably since 1986, but it's done so organically through a series of amendments and additions, and not with a kind of holistic step back at whether it's achieving what is desired. I also don't need to tell you that, as ICAS put it, the problem the debt landscape has seen is that it's complex and can be bewildering for the people needing to interact with it, and that's not desirable. And it's borne out by the key matters raised in response to the call for evidence. So, the key points were the purpose of insolvency should be to offer people a fresh start, that the barriers to entry are too high for some people, leaving them without an insolvency option. Ongoing restrictions and repayment mean that the burden of debt lingers for individuals. Responses also flag that there's a lack of consistency and coordination in how the different processes operate. And so people are confused by the different options available to them and the different consequences that those options have. And then if things go wrong for individuals, they can be thrown out of their insolvency process without being guided towards an appropriate alternative. And then finally, in terms of the headline points, it was a consistent theme that not everyone is getting good, impartial advice before they enter formal insolvencies. And so these are the really critical themes that colleagues in our policy function will be considering over coming months, so that we have a personal insolvency framework genuinely updated for the 21st century. I do have a little bit of a caveat to add that my policy colleagues have asked me to mention, and that is that, as you know, insolvency is an incredibly technical, complicated area, and the change needs very careful consideration. Um, so I can reassure you that there will be consultation and further engagement throughout this year before any changes are made to the framework. And secondly, that sadly we know people are struggling now and they need whatever help can be given to them. So my policy colleagues are also looking at whether there are any quicker changes that could be made in the shorter term. It is likely that those changes are limited though, but we are looking nonetheless. So then in terms of the longer time frame, colleagues will be looking at in detail at the routes into insolvency, the barriers to entry, and how to ensure that individuals access the most appropriate solution for their needs. They're looking at the current processes, the interactions between them, and whether changes need to be made. How to tackle the few individuals who are reckless or who do seek to commit fraud, and options for structural reform of the overall framework. And in terms of the timeline for that longer term work, colleagues' expectation is that they will issue a consultation on those proposed changes in early 2024. So that's the summary of the policy news. Moving on now to the statistics, and we've had a little bit of information on that already from Gary in the first session. But first of all, I do just want to mention some changes coming up to the way that the official statistics from the Insolvency Service are being presented now, and some changes that will be coming up throughout the year. So for the Insolvency Service official statistics series, the termination of Insolvency Service enforcement outcomes will be replaced by management information, with key figures published monthly and more detail published in a quarterly corporate scorecard. That was quite a tongue twister. The release of monthly insolvency statistics will be made permanent. Those were originally introduced as a temporary measure during the COVID pandemic, but they've been really helpful and popular. And they'll be merged with the quarterly statistics from April 2024. Additional information is also going to be published. So increased frequency of IVA outcomes and providers, IVA numbers by approval month as well as registration month, and the numbers of DRO and breathing space applications by competent authority or money advisor group, and publication of the termination data for IVAs. So particularly on this final point, I should say that our statisticians are mindful of the real complexity of data in this space, especially as relates to terminations, because of the transfers of cases that can happen and do happen between firms. And that's why those changes are going to be coming in during 2024, once the detail and the kind of confidence intervals and the other variables of those statistics has been worked through. So turning to the next slide, and let me just take a sip of water. So these are the company insolvency numbers for England and Wales, and they continue to show that increase from the historically low numbers seen during the pandemic. And the quarterly number of insolvencies in Q2 2023 was the highest since Q2 in 2009. But the historically high insolvency numbers do need to be seen in the context of an increase in the Companies House register. So there are now 4.7 million active companies on the Companies House register 10 years ago. And so that equates to a liquidation rate of 52 per 10,000 active companies in the 12 months running up to the 30th of June this year. And that's up from 43.9 in the previous year. But that rate is much lower than the figure for 2009, when we previously had those highest recorded quarterly insolvency numbers. So the rate this year, to remind you, was 52 per 10,000, and the rate in 2009 was nearly 95 per 10,000, and that reflects the changing size of the register. So moving on to the next slide, in terms of the corporate insolvencies in Scotland, the overall trend and rate is very similar to that for England and Wales. And as with England and Wales, it's CVLs that have led the increase in insolvency numbers compared to the pre-pandemic. But there is a higher compulsory liquidation rate and a lower CVL rate for Scotland compared to England and Wales. And then just to confirm, so the number of insolvencies in Q2 2023 was the highest quarterly level since Q2 2012, and the liquidation rate was 51.6 per 10,000 active companies in the most recent 12-month period, and that was up from 41.8 in the previous year. So looking at the next slide, and I'm really sorry if you're having to squint a little bit at the screen here, but as David said, these slides will be coming round. All large sectors, unfortunately, saw insolvencies in the last 12 months to June than in the previous months, and construction continues to be the most affected sector. Insolvencies in wholesale and retail trade and in accommodation and food service increased by more than in administrative and support services and professional and scientific and technical. So there's no shift in the sectors that were the most common in the 12 months to Q2 last year compared with Q2 this year. And the ordering has not changed for the top 4 sectors. I do just have to add a little bit of note of caution here to the data. They haven't yet been seasonally adjusted, and they come with the usual warnings that Companies House data is self-reported. So I hope that was useful. In terms of the agency strategy, so moving on to that area, you'll remember that we previously launched a 5-year strategy, and well, time has flown by and we're now in year 3. So I'm just going to touch briefly on some of the progress to date and flag some of the changes that are upcoming. Let me just switch slides. Oh. Lovely. So the slide shows some of the core projects that have been completed. We obviously very proud of the breathing space innovation, which has now seen 164,000 applications. We've launched new director guidance, a new hub online and for directors in terms of their decision making and making decisions at the right time. We've launched our aftercare service on bankruptcy and insolvency cases, and we've been focusing our enforcement efforts on COVID abuse against committed by directors, and we've made a host of hopefully helpful changes to the way our partners engage with us, including publishing our forms online and so on. So then in terms of next key developments, we're all kind of anxiously anticipating the introduction of the economic crime levy and the increased powers for Companies House. That will see much closer working between Insolvency Service, investigation colleagues and Companies House in order to tackle money laundering. And there are a set of new powers that will come along with those reforms as well. And on that, we're working closely with Companies House to make sure that insolvency practitioners and people within the insolvency sector are receiving enough information about the changes that are coming up, how you're all affected, how your interactions with Companies House will adjust and change over time. And there'll be a series of DRIP articles and stakeholder newsletters coming out soon. And I know that Companies House are working on a kind of an online hub of information for everybody affected by the changes to those systems. On enforcement, just moving back to the strategy, we're creating a capability to conduct criminal investigations in Scotland, and we'll be introducing a new case management system, FCMC, which is on track for next April. And again, there's going to be more comms on that from us soon, and some IP testing ongoing, so that the ways in which you interact with that case management system are smooth. And here it's a useful point for me to apologise again to anyone who's been affected by problems with our ISIS system recently. We're going through a really major programme of remediation in terms of our online and IT services, and I'm really sorry if you've experienced problems or blips with that. I think that all of those have now been resolved, but thank you for bearing with us. So let me move on to the next slide. For those of you keeping count, I've covered off the policy announcements, the stats update, and our strategy. So the last bit is a bit more my home turf, the regulatory priorities. I'll start by making my usual statement, bear with me, of making absolutely clear that I know the substantial majority of IPs are really hardworking, capable, professional people. And I know you're just as frustrated as I am when there is bad practice that undermines the profession. Unfortunately, the stuff that comes to my desk tends to be the negative. It tends to be the worst end of the spectrum. And so naturally, that is our area of focus. But as Stephen was setting out earlier, there are some common themes that crop up, and I will run through those in a moment, where I want to add real encouragement to you to be sure of your processes and your quality in those areas, but also to thank the regulators for their continued prioritisation of the areas of concern that we have. So let me move slides. So just to navigate this slide, the issues at the top here, they relate to personal insolvency matters, and those at the bottom cover the corporate side. We've continued to work really actively in the space of IVA, in the IVA space. There are, it's fair to say, really enduring concerns about the quality of advertising, the quality of referrals, reports of manipulation of income and expenditure, and abuse of contracted out services. And those do continue to give really serious concern to everybody across the industry, and to regulators. So I'm pleased that we've been able to take an important set of measures to try and address those points. So the JIC has introduced a new SIP 3.1. There is new volume provider monitoring guidance, including a new definition of volume provider that the RPBs have arrived at. There is proactive work by the Advertising Standards Authority on the quality of advertising, and continued work by them to make sure that their framework is up to date and responding to the ways in which social media are used now in order to advertise insolvency services. And the FCA, as you'll all know, has intervened on debt packager remuneration. I'll turn in a minute to the kind of the forthcoming activities, because I continue to be worried about this, but let me run through the areas of corporate priorities. So I don't think it will be a surprise at all to see that we've been taking a close interest in BBLs, including providing IPs with really granular information on the appointments that they have, where on, basically showing where BBLs have been taken out, so that we're not seeing directors trying to mislead you about whether they've had COVID support. We're also taking a close interest in RPS claims, so that's redundancy payment service claims, given the previous fraud that's happened there. But also because we're conscious there's been a real high number of director claims rejected by the RPS in recent months. I think it's been as high as 50% of director claims have been turned down. And so on that front, I'm really keen that we make sure that we're providing better information to you as IPs. I know that director applications can be a tricky area, and so our technical team, led by Justin Dion, has been running a series of webinars, and we will be publishing a set of information on Dear IP to really help you to understand how the RPS decision making runs in relation to director claims, so that we're seeing fewer cases turned down and fewer cases come through to tribunal. But as you would expect, we're also working closely with RPBs around suspected abuse. And then finally, again, to pick up on the theme from Stephen, we're taking a really close interest in the quality of director investigations submitted. There has been concern that the quality of engagement in some cases has dropped off, that the contemporaneous nature of reporting to the DCRS has dropped off in some areas, and we're worried that potentially lower asset returns in corporate insolvencies may be stymieing your abilities to undertake thorough investigations. So that's something that we're working really closely with the RPBs about, to understand to what extent that is a problem and whether there's anything further that we can do there. As I said, we're also looking to the future. So, on IVAs, our concerns are enduring. I'm genuinely not sure yet if we've taken enough action to address them. It's possible that we have, and it's possible that more needs to be done. So, we're taking stock a bit over the next few months. My team's going to be commissioning some research on these points of concern, looking to establish some really clear and quality evidence about whether there is mis-selling. If there is, where's it occurring and what's it looking like? And how is it manifest? I don't want to just assume that it is a problem because we hear that people could be in a better solution. That's not what the test in the law is. That's not what your obligations are. But I also hear really concerning reports of people being coached and told to lie in their conversations with IP firms when they're taken on for a when they're doing their SIP 3.1 take on calls. So we really want to try and get to the bottom of what's happening, where it's happening, and how it's happening. And from that base, we can explore what more is needed. Now, in the long term, my expectation is that a lot of these concerns will be addressed by the personal insolvency review, but there must be action that we can take in the shorter term, whether it's in how we regulate or what we're asking RPBs to look at, or in some of the protective measures that firms can take themselves. So I'm also keen that we look through the other end of the telescope, though, that we are improving the information available to consumers. So as an agency, we've published a series of short blogs on personal insolvency, trying to help demystify the provisions, but also provide, that neutral and trusted voice in a world in which there's a lot of confusing and, as Ika said in its response, kind of potentially bewildering information. We'll have another follow-up blog on scams shortly because we continue to see the vulnerable people targeted in relation to scams and not being advised properly of the potential consequences of action that they're encouraged to take. The IVA Standing Committee is also looking at potential changes to the IVA protocol, if that would be helpful, particularly if change is needed in response to cost of living challenges. Now, so far, the framework seems to be operating in a sufficiently flexible way, but it is something we're mindful of. We keep that under review. And also with the protocol having been in place for, I think it's nearly 2 years now, or coming up on 2 years now, it's useful to review how well that's working and whether there are, any wrinkles that need to be ironed out, or whether there's evidence for necessary change. At the end of the year, we're also going to be doing a thematic review of take-on practices. So following up from the new SIP 3.1, we'll be looking at take-on practices of IVAs, and we'll be discussing the terms of reference for that in the next few months with the regulator bodies. But I also want to extend that conversation more widely with everybody within the sector, really, about what else would help. So I'm conscious, for example, the very substantial change for FCA regulated entities with their new consumer duty, and that will become the lens through which the FCA regulates. So what does that mean for creditors' engagement and their decision making and voting? What does it mean in terms of lending decisions in the first place? And what lessons could we take from it? Is it about, are there other important lessons for us around the provision of consumer information or support, or around value and service? Now, naturally, our overriding statutory obligations to creditors mean that we won't have an overriding duty to consumers, but I do think it will be important for us to think through that lens of how things can be improved from a consumer perspective, but also how it's going to change that wider landscape given the interaction of other entities with the personal insolvency landscape. And then I'm also keen that we look a bit further ahead as well. So, what other wider changes are happening? AI is already being used in the sector. Is that going to increase? In what areas will we see it increase? In what way do we want that to be examined or regulated, or do we want standards in relation to it? How is it going to affect service provision and engagement and decision making? So those are things that are kind of on my mind in terms of the long-term regulatory architecture. But I hope, as I've made clear on all of these points, we're really keen to hear from you too about your thoughts and perspectives on the challenges that you see, on how we deal with those, how we address them, but also some of the opportunities that there are coming up. So I'm going to wrap up there. I've got one shameless plug coming on the next slide for a future event hosted by the Insolvency Service. Our policy and research conference is on the 10th of November at Liverpool University. And if anybody is interested in attending, please do get in touch with the email address on the screen. And I'll wrap up there, but I can see there's a number of questions in the chat. Hopefully I'll know the answer to them. We'll see in a minute.
Thank you very much, Claire. So yeah, so we have got most questions from any session so far today. So people are obviously interested in what you were saying and what you've got to do. So I have to scroll back up now because there's been so many. Right, first one. What was the reasoning behind exclusion of sole practitioner firms from regulation? Because that sort of structure is known as one that's used for the IVA factories, which is a concern to the profession.
So I don't know the detailed answer, I'm afraid, but I can make an assumption, but just please add the health warning that it is an assumption, that my assumption is that it isn't currently subject to a regulatory gap. My assumption is that policy colleagues on examination will have determined that the practitioner and the activity within that firm could, well, within that practice, I should say, can already be subject to the regulatory and disciplinary controls considered necessary. The detail I expect will be set out in the government's response to the consultation. And I'm very happy to follow up with ICAS afterwards if it's useful to send around the actual answer rather than my hypothesis.
Okay, right. Does the government have more to do to rebut the allegations that the insolvency regulatory framework isn't working?
So I don't know. I think that's a tricky one, is the answer off the top of my head. Our minister, so Minister Hollingwake spoke at, so the Westminster Minister responsible for insolvency matters, spoke at Insolvency Live earlier this year, and he does have concerns about some of the regulatory framework. He is concerned about the examples of very poor practice that have been seen, and he does want to see an increase in consistency across the four regulators. But as I said, there's real confidence that those improvements towards consistency and to address poor practice where sadly it occurs, there's real confidence that those can be achieved through non-legislative means, through working collaboratively together. And so that's absolutely what our priority will be over the next year, working with ICAS and the other bodies to get more consistent outcomes and to address the gaps that the minister set out in the original consultation.
Okay, thank you. Scotland is currently looking at the mental health moratorium, and just what are the lessons that can be learned from the England and Wales mental health crisis breathing space?
I'm just looking to see if I've got, so I'm afraid that I'm not an expert on breathing space, and the quick answer is I'm really sorry, I don't know. Very happy to follow up, but let me just look through the information that my colleagues have given me to see if I have anything in particular here. I'm afraid I don't. I know that I am conscious that our numbers on the mental health breathing space applications are on the low side, and I understand that there, anecdotally, that the concern is that the person entering it perhaps it has a very complex set of needs and assessments that are required, and may not have the confidence that by the end of the breathing space those will all be resolved. So I know that breathing space is something that's subject to regular examination, and we'll be looking at those points of learning, but I'm really sorry I don't have the answer to my fingertips.
Okay, thanks. Another one related to the personal insolvency, just in terms of the personal insolvency review, will the outcomes of that be shared with the accountant in bankruptcy in Scotland, because they've just announced that there's also going to be a review there?
Yeah, absolutely. So we work quite closely with our colleagues in the accountant in bankruptcy. I meet with them every month, and we meet as an organisation quarterly, and been really interested to see the emerging themes and work from the AIB's review in this space as well. So yes, absolutely, we've had conversations already about the emerging themes from the personal insolvency review, and we'll be continuing to talk to them excuse me, I'm a bit hoarse, about both any short-term changes that could be made to the England and Wales regime as I set out, but especially in terms of that longer term picture so that there's coherence and across kind of the United Kingdom, given the differences that there are, but the need for dovetailing where that happens and the different experiences of individuals.
Okay. Next question is, will we end up with 3 sets of operating standards across the UK, as the proposals only cover Great Britain and not Northern Ireland? And then we've also got the position in Scotland where certain processes are dissolved. So yeah, separate processes and separate standards. How do you get that all to marry up?
Yeah, so I'm conscious, for example, that at the moment we do have different SIPs in relation to in relation to areas that are distinct in Scotland, and of course that creates additional work and additional challenge for those of you who practice in both jurisdictions. I think part of the reason why this next step has got to be taken, well, part of the reason why the announcements have taken some while to finalise and resolve, and part of the reason why the next stage will also be undertaken carefully and in a really considered way, is to try and avoid any friction wherever we can. So if there need to be different standards, if there need to be different operating procedures, of course there will be, because we've got to respect the rights and of those devolved administrations to determine their own arrangements, and also to reflect the needs of the processes and the circumstances and the individuals who they support. But we're also really conscious of the regulatory cost that brings and the friction that can cause. And so colleagues will be really mindful of that. We also meet regularly with colleagues in Northern Ireland. Typically, the Northern Ireland approach follows that of England and Wales, but there are distinct difficulties there at the moment because of the devolved assembly not sitting. And so all of that, I'm afraid, needs to be worked through. So I'm sorry that's not a definitive answer, but it's one we're really, really alive to.
Okay, thanks. Right, next question is, with regard to asset recovery and non-compliant directors, do you think that stronger legislation could be sought from the government to force directors to toe the line?
That's a tricky one, isn't it? I don't get the impression that legislation is going to be sort of available in the short term. A lot of what we're seeing from particularly the government response on insolvency practitioner regulation is that we're entering quite a period of churn. Or perhaps churn's the wrong time or the wrong term. Sorry. Next year there will be a general election, and so expectations about what will practically be achieved between now and the other side of a general election, I think we need to be quite realistic. And then once there is a general election, the government that is elected will want to set its own strategy in terms of its position in relation to regulation of directors and of others. So the simple answer is I don't know, because I think it will be determined by that very top level approach by the government of the day. And as I say, we're entering a period in which that could change. It may not, but it could. So at the moment, the priority very much in terms of director education is about trying to improve. You've got a spectrum, you've got your kind of standard bell curve of people who are going to be bent on, misconduct, whatever the weather, and people who are kind of erring by accident. And then a vast majority of people who are sort of doing a decent job and maybe muddling through in some circumstances. So the real focus on trying to help and support people who could become better and who would wish to, and the continuing kind of prioritization within our enforcement and intelligence functions to take action against the worst offenders. The increased funding and powers that come with the Companies House reform will be enormously helpful in terms of that last piece about taking action, and hopefully will act as a deterrent to others who may kind of fall into criminal behaviour as a result of previous poor practice. But that was a long and winding answer. Sorry, Shona.
Yeah, no. Well, I think that there's been, obviously there's been recent imprisonments for striking off offences, which was quite a clear deterrent. I noticed also in your slides that you had it's not compensation orders, but repayment or undertakings. The number was quite small, so I'll need to see what it is in the slide. But in terms of monies that being paid by directors in terms of undertakings, can you just explain how that differs from the compensation orders? Because I understand there's still only 2 of those so far. Or
I'm really sorry, Shona, but I am not a technical expert, and I'm afraid I don't know.
Okay, well, maybe we might follow that up, but that brings our
Absolutely.
session to an end anyway. So no more questions that you don't know the answer to. But thank you very much for that, Claire. In terms of just going over the strategy update, the statistics, and what's coming up in the future. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.